I was the first president, the founder, in 1975, and I'm very proud of it, particularly given what it's become, far more significant than it was in the beginning. There had been Jewish community councils created in other cities of the country. We said, let's have one organization. So we decided to try to get the Jewish community in New York to speak with a single voice. And that was the goal, on the theory that that had far more effectiveness than having all these other organizations speaking individually. It was a wonderful experience in my life. I had, as an adolescent, watched as the story of the Holocaust unfurled, and it had affected me very profoundly. That burned my pride in being Jewish as deeply as I could. My parents sent me to a school in New York that was smack in the middle of Harlem, a very progressive school, unique in the city in that it had an enormous cross-section of kids, ethnically, religiously, every which way. In 1947, we stood online all night at Ebbets Field to watch Jackie Robinson play his first Major League Baseball game in New York. And then the whole class celebrated the next year when the State of Israel was created, even though the Jewish component of the class was less than 25%. After spending a couple of years in Washington, working on the Hill for the Congress, I decided that I had to begin to think about having a family and making some money, and I had an opportunity to join my cousin in the construction business. So I specialized in affordable housing. We did wonderful things. We built the first racially integrated apartment house ever built in Washington, D.C., of which I'm very proud. That led to my being involved in the civil rights movement. I marched in the '63 march. I became friendly with Bayard Rustin, Martin Luther King, the head of the Sleeping Car Porters Union, and Roy Wilkins, and his nephew Roger Wilkins, and that was a very important part of my life, in addition to my Jewish life. Well, Hugh Carey and Ed Koch, who were exemplary public officials. They were people who did everything on the merits and managed to also be very effective politicians. And the governor comes in and he says, I want you to become chairman of the MTA. And I knew the governor pretty well by then. And I said, are you out of your mind? I said, I ride the subways, you don't. So then he had the mayor Ed Koch called me the next day, and then Stanley Fink, who was Speaker of the Assembly, and I finally said, hey, public service is a source of greatest satisfaction for me, so I said yes. And then I bought billions of dollars worth of subway cars from France, Japan, and Canada. I was then hauled before the Senate Finance Committee, I'll never forget this, and accused of not caring about my country because I hadn't given the contract to the one domestic rail car manufacturer. But his prices were much too high. A senator from Pennsylvania said, Mr. Ravitch, don't you care about your country? And I said, well, I served in its armed forces twice. I've spent the better part of the last 7 years in public service at no compensation whatsoever. I leave it to you, Senator, to decide whether I care about my country. We chaired the Millennium Housing Commission, and we wrote a very, hopefully useful report that set forth some policy ideas for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Probably the most rewarding experience I had in my professional life was working with the governor in 1975 to save New York City from bankruptcy, which would have been a sheer utter disaster for the 7 million people who lived here. And then in September, we were running out of money and running out of borrowing capacity. And the governor asked the president for federal aid, and the president said no. And that produced the famous headline in the Daily News, Ford to New York, drop dead. Then that Sunday afternoon, the governor convened all the leading businessmen in New York to his office. I was present. We explained that the city was going to run out of money in a month or so, and we asked if the business community would go to Washington and put pressure on the Republican administration to change their mind. And they all did that. And finally, President Ford agreed to provide the city with money. A few weeks later, I found myself in the Treasury Department working out the details of a $3 billion loan that the federal government made to the city of New York. The very obvious conviction, I think, shared by every Jew, which is that if the state of Israel, if anything would happen to the state of Israel, it would affect the worldwide Jewish community in a very profound impact. Plus, I've been there many, many times. I chaired the effort called Project Renewal, which we raised a lot of money from the Jewish community in the United States to help rebuild the Hatikva section of Tel Aviv. That was a very exciting thing. I knew the mayor of Tel Aviv, Chich Lahat, who had been a hero in the 48 war. We became good friends. I knew Teddy Kollek very well, who was the mayor of Jerusalem. He took me on my first walk around the wall in Jerusalem. Well, I took the whole family in 1970, and when we got to the wall, my 8-year-old son, he just turned 8, saw that people were writing messages on pieces of paper and stuffing them into the nooks and crannies of the wall. And I was startled that he had observed that and he had done it. And I did a terrible thing. When he walked out, I grabbed his piece of paper and looked at it. And what he had written at the age of 8 was, "I wish that Israel would live in peace forever." And I broke into tears. And that was the most formative experience of my life as a Jew.